Hey guys, it's Standing for Truth coming to you live tonight. I've got a guest with me. His YouTube channel name is SnakeWasRight. We're gonna have just a little dialogue here on creation, evolution. Should be fun. I appreciate Taylor. I'm gonna refer to him as for joining me in this discussion tonight, as well as I've got Landon here who's going to just moderate for us, make sure that the discussion is flowing nicely, and just making sure that it's going well. So I want to introduce Taylor. If you wanted to say a few things, brother, go ahead. Floor is yours.
Howdy. My channel name is SnakeWasRight, and I'm an atheist. I'll mention that I went to a Catholic school for 4 years, just for that background. That's pretty much where I became an atheist. And the channel name, just to explain that, SnakeWasRight, just means I think that the knowledge of good and evil is a good thing to have. So that's my intro.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that. Landon, you'll be moderating for us. We're going to go, so structure-wise, it's just going to be free-flowing dialogue, little interruptions. Landon's going to be moderating, making sure everything goes well. After the hour mark, it can become a free-for-all at that point if people just want to talk about random things or whatever for another 45 minutes or an hour. Should be cool with me. Thanks for moderating for us, Landon.
Oh yeah, no problem. It's good to be here. So
awesome. Thanks, brother. I appreciate it. So I guess my question would be, just to kind of start it off, Taylor, because I'm sure we'll be throwing around the word evolution quite a bit during this discussion. But at the end of the day, I think the term evolution can mean many different things, right? In general, it just means change over time. I would say, biological evolution would mean a change in, say, allele frequency or gene pool in populations over time or generations. Like, what would your definition be?
I think that's a fair definition for biological evolution.
Okay. I think for me, in regards to, say, the model that I hold to, like a biblical based model, I'm not opposed to change. I'm not opposed to, a change in allele frequency or gene pool, of course, but that type of, micro evolutionary variation, Taylor, where you get a change in, say, the frequency of the expression of different traits. I don't think that's really disputed among, creationists or evolutionists. I just think that explains, the small scale variation, but not the major innovations, the major origin events of, say, major new forms of life. Do you think that allele frequency, change in allele frequency, would explain, say, quote unquote, the arrival of the fittest? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what the point of the theory of evolution is to explain the biodiversity. And that's what Charles Darwin's book was, The Origin of Species, speciation. And so, yes, I do think that there is sufficient evidence to say that the mechanisms of evolution, whether they be just mutation or just changing allele frequencies that already exist, or dialing up the tallness or shortness, of whatever trait, we do have evidence of that creating speciation.
So would you say, just based on what you said on the mechanisms, would you say that, you believe in an unguided process of natural selection acting upon random variation or random mutation? Like, would that be the basic mechanism behind that type of large scale evolution?
Well, it's not unguided. There are evolutionary forces acting on the populations at all times and maintaining the allele frequencies or getting rid of unbeneficial ones and conserving the beneficial ones.
Right. So I guess it would be my position that, say, if we're looking at mutations, I would say that mutations are more so destruction and not construction. I would say that these mechanisms, neo-Darwinism, I would say that it lacks, incredible explanatory power in regards to, the origin of phenotypic complexity, anatomical novelty, and also, the origin of non-gradual modes of transition, say abrupt fossil appearance. I think in short, I just think mutations and natural selection, natural selection is a fine tuning process, and you can certainly get variation based on mutations, but I would say that they lack significant creative powers. Like, what would you say to my point on that?
So I had to listen back on my debate with Nephilim a couple of times to understand really what he was trying to say. He kept asking me, how does the beneficial effects of a mutation outweigh or overcome, is what he said, overcome the deleterious effects. And so it took me a couple of times to actually understand, because I think what he was actually trying to ask is that, well, I think what he was assuming in his question is that each mutation, no matter if it's beneficial or not, that it necessarily comes with deleterious effects. And I was just trying to explain that while most mutations are harmful, there are some individual ones that are not. And those individual ones they could carry a trade-off, but sometimes they don't. And it's not like you carry with you all of the bad mutations. And I think that's what Nephilim was assuming there, because you can just get a single beneficial protein out of a mutation, and you don't necessarily have to get bad mutations. It's just a numbers game.
No, I appreciate the response. I think, just to clarify, would you say that mutations that are beneficial and have no ultimate deleterious effect, would you say that they would be rare, more so?
Very rare.
Okay, so I think, so if I look at my starting point, say in regards to a biblical model and the fall, so we would predict death, decay. So obviously, judging by the first few minutes of our back and forth here, we don't disagree on mutations. We don't disagree on natural selection. But I think the bottom line would be that, selection would remove, and I think you agree with this based on listening to what you said, selection is going to remove the worst deleterious mutations, the worst detrimental mutations, and it's going to amplify only the best rare beneficial mutations. But my point would be that this means that, say, the accumulating damage based on these, low impact deleterious mutations, the one that natural selection, the low impact mutations that are invisible to natural selection, that accumulating damage is largely invisible. And to make it simple for the audience, kind of like rust on a car. Because if you think of it this way, Taylor, we've got a genome of, say, 3 billion letters. And if you take out one letter, change one letter randomly, say, are you going to have a huge fitness effect? Obviously not. It's going to have a tiny fitness effect.
And it could knock out the whole system.
Well, I would say it's kind of like rust on a car. You can't see each rust event, but it's continuous and destructive. So
if you get rust on the right part, the whole thing won't work anymore. But you could get rust on somewhere where it doesn't even matter.
Well, the thing is, if you're looking at the genome as a whole, and just say, one random mutation that might not have an obvious, phenotypic effect on the actual genetic content, it's going to be slightly deleterious, kind of like that individual rust spot on the car. So let's say the accumulating damage is largely invisible, like I was saying, but these adaptations, obviously I'm not disagreeing with those, say antibiotic resistance, melanoprotein example, like whatever it is, those will be highly visible. But that means you're going to have to present me with, say 1,000 examples of adaptation through whether it's beneficial duplication, point mutation, just to address the key. I think the key issue, Taylor, is net gain versus net loss.
Yeah, I think I see the problem here. And I do want to point out that mutations are very frequent in bacteria and viruses.
Right.
And we can see them evolving rather quickly. But your point about the genome accumulating damage is it actually is able to edit out things that it doesn't need or that are damaging it. And there's just like as many ways as it can acquire beneficial traits, there are like at least dozens of different ways that the organism can get rid of bad traits. So, for example,
yep, go ahead.
Well, the genome is constantly degrading in a way.
I agree.
It's always at victim of entropy, but the good genes will spread. So the genes that don't get used, that have no pressures on them, will pretty much just get forgotten in the shamble. And the good genes will keep getting used and keep getting spread. And the deleterious mutations or genes will just, sometimes they'll just disappear due to mutations. There are gene deletions that are mutations as well. And so there's just so many ways that the genome naturally loses this information, but it will conserve the good information. And one of those ways is breeding. That's one of the great things about sexual reproduction, is because you might have a good gene and a bad gene, and your partner might not have either one, and you have 50-50 chance of passing on. You might only pass on your good gene, or you might only pass on your bad gene. But if you pass on the good gene, then that's going to conserve in your child, and your child might not inherit your bad gene. And that's how, through breeding, through that is a selection process of just reproducing.
Well, okay,
the bad stuff just naturally falls away.
Yeah, I would say natural selection is just a fancy way of saying, differential reproduction, who's reproducing the most. But I wrote a few things down on what you said here. So, for example, you said beneficial mutations are rare and the genome is constantly degrading. And we see entropic degeneration on a genomic level. So I agree with that. But I think it's pretty obvious that due to the rarity of say beneficial mutations that are actually not deleterious to some extent, those beneficial mutations are not going to compensate for, as I said, I think it comes down to a net loss versus a net gain of information. Those beneficial mutations are not going to compensate for the net loss of information. And natural selection, because you talked about traits, natural selection, it's a fine-tuning mechanism. It keeps the species as good as it can be. So I don't disagree with that. So we do agree on that, but it's severely constrained by, what's called selection interference. And just to go into that a little bit, selecting for one trait, as you talked about, interferes with selecting for another trait. And when you have billions of traits, Taylor, segregating in the population, then the selection process actually starts to work against itself. And what that means at the end of the day is that you end up with being able to only select the best and worst mutations, as I talked about earlier. So I think evolutionists, I think you're guilty of this right now. They assume, based on universal common ancestry, right, it's got to be true type thing. So they're assuming that these mutations, they're going to have a net neutral effect. But we know that's wrong based on this selection interference. And I think, just to put it in a nutshell on everything that you said there, and I wrote down, the problem is that, we know that beneficial mutations are very rare, which we agree on, so that's good. And non-neutral mutations are consistently deleterious, as we should actually expect, with typographical errors in a text. So I think increasing fitness is going to be very difficult. And very much problematic. And you talked about, beneficial mutations, say in bacteria, or just beneficial mutations in general. The problem that I have, though, Taylor, is that, the best beneficial mutations, they're mostly reductive. Let's take sickle cell anemia, for example. It's got a significant impact. I heard you talk about, that with Neph, and I agree with everything you said. But what it is, it's a broken gene, broken protein, And in the long run, it's not really taking things forward, and it's not really addressing the issue of net gain
Broken is
versus net
relative.
loss.
There's nothing broken in the chemistry. You can't break chemistry. It doesn't understand what it's doing. It just does what it does. So when you have sickle cell, it's not. It just doesn't work the way that you want it to, maybe for oxygenation, but it has other beneficial effects.
So you're saying it's okay. So you're saying it's deleterious in one way, but it's beneficial in another. But I'm saying it comes down to a net loss versus a net gain. So how are you going to compensate for the information loss based on, you know, a couple rare beneficial mutations? Because if you're throwing out a ton of information, you know, and you're seeing erosion of information, erosion of nucleotides, how are you going to compensate for the actual information loss? Because a couple of rare beneficials are not going to counterbalance the accumulating damage. So with me, under the assumption of death, decay, degeneration, that's consistent. But to take your fish to fisherman or your bacteria to biologist and build a genome, I don't know how you're going to build a genome by degrading information. And you talked about bacteria. I just want to touch on that real quick, see what you think. You can just Google, you know, bacteria, reductive evolution, and it's a commonplace. There's tons of papers that, you know, they're subject to reductive evolution. Like if you take Linkage, for example, there were beneficial mutations, there were adaptations seen. So I'm going to agree with you on that, but they were largely accomplished, Taylor, through loss of function, loss of promoter, loss of genes. So his own data, Linkage, for example, he's revealing clear evidence of genetic degeneration. And that's not really going to take your fish to fisherman. It's not going to take your evolution forward because it's a net loss of information. So my question would be for you, I'm really curious, how do you deal with the net loss versus the net gain? Go ahead.
All right, well, I'm going to need a couple minutes. Well, you mentioned loss of information being a mutation, and that loss can actually be a gain. So we have a bunch of DNA, or we don't have a bunch of DNA that the apes do, and that's one of the major differences between us and them, is we deleted some regulatory mechanisms. So you can actually have that as a way of getting rid of bad DNA. We deleted a bunch of DNA and got smarter as the result. So,
like, I just want to clarify, just to follow what you're saying. Is this more hypothesizing, theoretical, because you're looking at both the genomes and comparing, or is this something that you've actually observed and seen, say, in the lab?
Well, when you compare the two genomes, there are similarities, and there are genes that we don't have that apes do have. So if you put that DNA, if you took the ape DNA and you took out those sections of DNA, I could send you the paper if you need that, but you would probably get a human. We can't clone humans, so we can't actually test that. But we would have
kind of theoretical
the same genome. Well, you would be working with a human genome at that point. You could just insert that.
I get what you're saying, but you're not really, like, let's say observable right now, you know, based on what we know about natural selection, based on what we know about, you know, mutation accumulation, because it's largely recognized that we accumulate, you know, 100 to 300 new mutations per person per generation. That's 7 billion mutations this generation, given the population that we know.
All those fine-tuning processes and mechanisms, they work against deleterious mutations and even useless DNA. We lose stuff naturally. If you don't use it, you lose it, basically, is what's going on here.
No, it's because these low impact mutations, as I was talking about earlier, they build up relentlessly because these deleterious mutations, Taylor, they're pouring in
and they delete themselves.
They can be removed,
right? And they don't get passed on as frequently as beneficial mutations.
No, they do, because most mutations are not neutral. They're nearly neutral. They build up in the population in the genome. They're invisible to natural selection. So how are you going if we inherit a multitude of old mutations?
Because if you don't
100
use it, you lose it. If there's no positive selection pressure, then it's likely it's just randomly going to go away one day, and that happens.
Well,
Those are gene deletion mutations.
Here's the problem, because and I think you agree with this. All the papers say it. Human mutation rate is 100 mutations per person per generation. That means, Taylor, that our children have about 100 mutations more than we have, and our grandchildren are going to have 100 more mutations than they have. So on a population level, like I said, that's 700 billion new mutations entering the human population this generation. So the question I'm asking you is, what type of selection could eliminate so many mutations that are pouring into the human population? Because they are passed on, and if they're at neutral, near neutral nucleotide sites, they erode information, but selection does nothing about it, because selection acts on the phenotype, not the genotype. It's either the organism as a whole or not at all, correct?
No, because we actually split our genotypes when we reproduce.
Correct. But those mutations, the ones that we're inheriting from our parents, 100 to 300, those are coming in to the next generation. And if they're near neutral, selection can't do anything about them, because I said at the beginning that selection will amplify the best beneficial mutations and get rid of the worst deleterious mutations. But it's those low impact neutral mutations, like rust on a car or a typographical error in, say, a book the size of an encyclopedia. Those are the ones that build up and erode our information systems over time. And there's no way natural selection can get rid of those. I mean, how do you explain that?
Natural selection can get rid of any gene. If they're near neutral, that it's not really doing anything. There's no selection pressure toward it other than just pure entropy. So if it becomes a problem for the organism, then there is a major selection pressure, and it will get selected out.
No, because
or the organism will go extinct, which most organisms have. It's that rare one that ekes by that will continue on the line.
See,
and
it's because
populations have bloomed and shrunk, and almost all of humanity was almost dead at a certain point, and we're back.
See, it's because these mutations at these near neutral nucleotide positions, Taylor, they're deleterious and subject to random drift, which makes them immune to selection. But these nucleotides, because you're saying it's not going to do anything because it's near neutral, but those nucleotide sites, they contain meaningful information, and the mutation contributes to the erosion of that information. So collectively, since we agreed that beneficial mutations are rare, obviously the near neutral nucleotides are going to account for most of the information in the genome. So just to make the audience understand it more, to put it into an analogy, this would be as true as the fact that all the seemingly insignificant letters in a book collectively add up to a clear message, Taylor. If we start to introduce typographical errors, say, most of the individual errors, they're only going to have an extremely trivial effect on the total message. So individually, I agree, they're truly insignificant, as you said. But here's the issue. It's that if this process is not halted, the message will eventually become corrupted and will eventually be completely lost. And that's what we're seeing in our genomes, because natural selection can't do anything about these near neutral, low impact deleterious mutations. So once again, how do you explain the net loss versus the net gain if you're going to take your fish to fishermen? Go ahead.
Well, since you haven't observed any of that, that's a much bigger leap than any amount of changes proposed by macroevolution. We haven't seen anything die just because it's so genetically corrupt. We can do that by breeding like dogs, but they're still pretty much healthy. And if you start breeding them with other dogs, those deleterious effects will start going away because they're mixing with healthy dogs.
The thing is, if you look at a lot of this dog breeding, let's just say, like a wolf to a Chihuahua, for example, for the most part, that's the degradation of information. If you take all the Chihuahuas and throw them back into the wild, obviously they're going to last one day.
It's not degradation.
Well, you're losing a lot of information, like the allelic variety and the allelic potential in, say, something like a Chihuahua versus something like a wolf, obviously we can agree that no,
they're essentially the same species. They can interbreed.
oh, I agree that they can interbreed, but the allelic potential and the allelic variability in something like a wolf. I mean, I've talked to dog breeders, and they can take two generic dogs and probably breed almost anything. But if you take two Chihuahuas, well, there's not enough allelic potential there to breed really in anything else, because the information has been lost. But I want to back up what I said about
Chihuahua out of Chihuahuas. You could just, because there are Chihuahua mixes, you could just keep mixing that whatever has Chihuahua in it with a dog of another breed, and generations down the line you will have no Chihuahua.
Well, obviously we're talking about artificial selection here, but it's still not explaining, the net
Same
loss
mechanisms.
because there's two models here, right? Like, I'm predicting death, decay, degeneration, and that's exactly what we see. But to go from your single cell, multi-cell fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal, monkey, bird, whatever it is, that's going to take massive increases in genetic information. And if there's a net loss versus a net gain, and what we see is a net loss of genetic information based on the accumulating damage of near neutral low impact mutations, that pretty much falsifies that type of pond scum to people evolution. And I got a ton of examples, because you talked about extinction, Taylor, and I've got a paper right here that talks about mammoth populations. So paleogenomic evidence, it's in the journals, but I can send it to you. But these mammoth populations were highly had a high genetic load, elevated genetic load, which led to their extinction. And even Neanderthals, they were highly inbred and had a very high genetic load. And the paper talks about how they were 40% less fit than modern humans based on accumulating genetic damage. Exactly. So all we see is death, degeneration,
so they don't get to pass on their
extinction.
shitty genes.
But the thing is, they're dying due to accumulation and near neutral mutations. And a lot of them are dying because they're highly inbred. So they're subgroups, they're mini populations. So what that is, it's a sneak preview as to where we're going based on this accumulating genetic mistakes. Because we know if it's a small, inbreeding population, well, they're going to decay and go extinct sooner. But the point is, it's inevitable. And natural selection can't act on these low impact deleterious mutations. So, once again, how do you explain this net loss versus net? Are you familiar with the hobbits, Homo floresiensis?
Yeah, so you've already demonstrated how natural selection takes care of this, because there are other animal lineages living on past all these other animals that have supposedly died of genetic corruption. But this is how natural selection works. 99% die and the 1% goes on.
But the thing is, the 1%, as I said, if we're accumulating 100 to 300 new mutations per person per individual, we're carrying along those near neutral mutations. So we're only declining with age, because there's a pandemic. You could probably even agree with me, Taylor. There's entropic degeneration on all levels. Just look around. Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, asthma, autoimmune disease, cancers, immunological related disease. I mean, it's just mutation related negative effects everywhere. So I don't see how that's consistent with your
well, how are these diseases mutating to be more fit?
Well, they're not mutating to be more fit, because the accumulating genetic load is what's revealing these. Because, for example, let's take
better at killing us. Some of them.
I'm sorry, go ahead, repeat that.
Some of these diseases are getting better at killing us. We can barely keep up with the flu. We now have MRSA, which is it's resistant to antibiotics.
Yeah, I agree. But the thing is, disease, death, decay, degeneration, mutation, that's not going to that's more consistent with the biblical based model. And even Lenski's own experiment with the so we see it in in bacterial populations. And you mentioned
really a problem for genetics anyway. That may be the case, but there's no papers that I'm aware of that puts any kind of clock on it, because these 100 mutations per generation is, if they're near neutral, they're just not going to impact the organism at all, so it doesn't matter. As soon as they become subject to selection pressures by being beneficial or not.
Well, I've got a paper as well, and what it shows is that even if a substantial fraction, Taylor, of the human genome is functional, say is not junk DNA, then the evolution of man would not even be possible based on this genetic degeneration. And because I know a lot of the evolutionists like to fight, and I'm sure we can get into that. They like to fight, ENCODE and how they revealed that, over 80% of our genome is transcribed into RNA. But even if I just gave you, if I just said, hey, listen, for sake of argument, most of the genome is junk. In this paper, it demonstrates that human evolution would still be impossible even if the genome was only 10% functional. And like I said, ENCODE has obviously revealed that over 80% of it is transcribed into RNA suggesting function. So once again, I mean, this type of evolution seems to be falsified, impossible, and more consistent with like a biblical-based model of death, decay, degeneration. Go ahead.
Could you cite that paper?
Yeah, it's here. I'll put it to the side. So, are you familiar with? I'm gonna put in the side chat, brother. But I wanted to ask you, as you look at that, are you familiar with? Well, you mentioned viruses, okay? So I've shown you, bacterial examples. I've shown you mammoth populations, Homo, Neanderthal, hobbits, for example. Entropic degeneration on all levels in regards to diseases. But even the H1N1 human version, and I got a paper here too if you wanted to see it. It's widely accepted, and you might be aware of this, that it went from, and this is the human version. They've got swine flu versions circulating right now, but that's besides the point. The human version, Taylor, it went from a red hot pandemic to a whimper to an extinction event in 90 years. And what was observed here in the study was a linear accumulation of mutations. So this is also genetic entropy at work. And evolutionists themselves, they cannot explain why the H1N1 virus is extinct in humans, because adaptive evolution obviously doesn't cause extinction. And the paper goes on.
It's not even a human virus. So you witnessed an attempt to evolve and it failed.
Yeah, this virus went from...
It attempted to adapt to a new environment, sort of, it worked, and then it couldn't go any further.
Well, what was seen was that there was a decline in functionality, which was predicted based on what we know about low impact.
It's not fit for human infection.
So are you familiar with what I'm talking about in regards to the H1N1 human version that went, because it was a red hot pandemic at first. Would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it killed how many millions of people? But in 90 years.
All of this is consistent with evolutionary theory.
I don't understand how, death, degeneration, mutation accumulation, say bacteria getting rid of genes, short-term but long-term degeneration. I don't understand how that's gonna, because for example, you talked about gene duplications a lot, and we can get into that, but even gene duplications, Taylor, those are almost, and tell me if you disagree with that, but gene duplications are almost universally deleterious. So even if I gave you, for sake of argument, just to not go on about it for an hour or 2 hours, if I just gave you a few rare beneficial duplications, they're still not going to be able to offset the many accumulating deleterious mutations, let alone all the other accumulating mutations that are not duplicated related. So, I mean, how do you explain the net loss versus the net gain? Because I'm not being convinced of that type of large scale evolution based on degeneration and decay of a genome. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. Can you make me understand it?
It's just a numbers game. You ask enough girls out, one of them will say yes.
My wife said
the
yes.
Same thing. You said gene duplication is almost universally deleterious, and that's just not true, because you can have extras of one gene. That's just basically a backup. Sometimes it's a problem, especially when the gene relies on a mount, and you can get too much of a thing being transcribed, but that's not always the case, especially with sex chromosomes.
Do you have like, because I noticed you said numbers games. Like, if you were to put some numbers on it, like, are you familiar with? Well, you're probably familiar with Haldane's dilemma, but are you familiar with the waiting time problem?
I think so. I'm gonna need a refresher.
Well, Haldane's dilemma is a little bit more old school, but it talks about, you know, these mutations we're talking about, because we can talk about all day, like, you know, duplications are going to build the genome, but it's all about these beneficial mutations if they exist. It's all about them going to fixation in a population. So there's a paper here called the waiting time problem, and I want to hear. I'd like to hear your thoughts about it, because you seem to know your stuff here. And what it does is it takes into consideration, Taylor, a pre-human population with a population size of approximately 10,000. And what we're looking at is how long is it going to take 2 nucleotides in that genome and then switch them to 2 other nucleotides at the same location. But if you're waiting for just one single mutation, Taylor, a single nucleotide, say, a single nucleotide change, and you're waiting for the change, because this is what it all comes down to, that change needs to take hold in the population and become selected to fixation. And it's very long to take that change and make a single specific nucleotide change, about 1.5 million years. So there's
I think I'm aware of this. If I'm not mistaken, it was a program written for a creationist that was commissioned for him, and he basically does not understand the model.
Well, the thing is, if you look at the,
I would have to look it up again, but that's what I remember of it.
Well, from if you look it up in the critiques, it's pretty rock solid. It's been read by over 10,000 scientists with no serious critique or rebuttal. But if you're looking at genetic words, say to get a string of 8 nucleotides, the time that it would take would be more time than the universe has actually had. So
what was it called again?
What's that?
What was it called again?
The waiting time problem. I think my whole point,
I remember researching it. I don't remember the exact details, but
it's a newer.
I was not convinced.
The thing is, what I'm trying to say is there's a multitude of problems. So I mean, you can go to the waiting time problem. You can go to Haldane's dilemma, you know, mutation, fixation. But the thing is, it all comes down to net gain versus net loss. And I haven't really seen any solid examples of, well, for one, how natural selection is going to compensate and how beneficial mutations are going to compensate for the influx of deleterious mutations. I mean, we're clearly going down and not up. And are you familiar with linkage groups?
Yeah.
So, for example, linkage groups, if those blocks of DNA are immune to recombination, for example, it's the best way I can say the good mutations and the bad mutations in these linkage groups then cannot be separated because they're immune to recombination. And as we agreed earlier, the bad mutations are overwhelmingly deleterious because the beneficials are rare. They outnumber the good mutations. So these linkage groups, aren't they only going to get worse and not better? I mean, they're only going to degenerate if these bad mutations are linked. You can throw in 1 or 2, say, beneficial mutations, but at the end of the day, they're just going to be overcome with bad mutations. It just seems like on all levels of our genome, it's just nothing but decay and degeneration. And that's what I personally would expect, given a biblical-based model. And it seems like the opposite of what you'd expect given a model of universal comprehension.
But everything shuffles around. Even the linkage sites are shuffled around. Every single thing inside the cellular mechanism shuffles around. And so you get a diversity of these combinations. And it's very, very, very slow. That's why evolution takes place in the millions and billions of years. So,
well, I mean, that's why.
So to go back to what I was starting off with, you shuffle things up and you get this diversity, and only the best ones get to go on. So it's actually a self-improving mechanism.
Right. So as I talked about at the beginning, I don't disagree with the fact that natural selection is going to amplify the best beneficial mutations, say antibiotic resistance, for example, just to name one, and get rid of the worst detrimental mutations. But it's the low impact, near neutral, deleterious mutations that natural selection can't do anything about. But I want to say something about the recombination real quick, and then you can address that. In those genomic regions that I'm talking about that are linked, the whole point is that there is no sexual recombination. So the good and the bad mutations are inseparably linked, and they can't be teased apart. So those
linkage sites change, though.
They're still linked, though. I mean, they can't be.
But the sites of those linkages can change.
They can. Oh, I agree that they can change, but they're going to change for the worst. Those linkage groups are only going to degenerate. It's a downward spiral, and it almost guarantees net genetic degeneration because they are linked, they're not teased apart, and those regions are going to experience predominantly bad mutations, and they can't be separated from the rare good mutations. So you throw one or two, just for sake of argument, in there, they're going to be neutralized by the large numbers of bad mutations. So that just speeds up the degeneration process. So there's too much degeneration going on to actually build a genome. How do you build a genome based on a net loss of information?
As soon as you start affecting the organism's ability to survive and breed, that gene line dies, so that it edits itself out. So, for example, it minimizes the impact every time. Like for turkeys are a kind of cool example. So only there will be like a bunch of male turkeys. Only the biggest, best, most healthiest of the turkeys all the other males will fight him, and whoever's the best, they'll all be his posse, and they'll protect his territory for him. The weaker male turkeys don't get to breed. Only the strongest one does. So they're maximizing. So if they have a little bit of deleterious effects, they're still maximizing the one that has the least, even if it's just these little rust spots.
I would say
it's constantly selecting out the bad and selecting for the good.
I would say, just so we don't go in circles, I think based on, just to sum up everything here, I would say, and then I'll see what you think about that. I think it seems like you think as long as beneficials happen, no matter how rare they are, Taylor, this type of bacteria to biologist evolution must be true, because it seems like, as long as you can show me selective adaptations happen, which I agree. But the thing is, it's hard to grasp how difficult it is to build a genome apart from design, because a population, Taylor, it can be undergoing genetic, kind of like these turkeys, okay? Like natural selection, fine-tuning process. These populations can be undergoing genetic decline due to the vast numbers of slightly deleterious mutations that I'm talking about, even while selection may be amplifying a handful of these beneficial mutations. And to make it understandable to the audience, to put it in layman's terms, just picture a 10-year-old car, Taylor. It's degenerating in all possible ways. You can install new windshield wipers, change the brakes, switch out the tires, but it's still degenerating in all possible ways. There's been an improvement, I agree with that, but not the type of improvement that's going to reverse the systematic degeneration. So I think it just comes down to net gain versus net loss, and I think the evidence is more so on the side of someone who holds to a biblical-based model. I don't understand how you're going to build a genome based on everything we've been talking about. Go ahead, brother.
So the mutations don't know they're beneficial or deleterious. Like, let's go back to H1N1. You could describe their leap to humans as an environment as a beneficial mutation because it allowed them to leap from one habitat to another. But apparently that wasn't a good. Well, it is what it is. But once they were in the human systems, they found that they couldn't adapt much. So they did change, and they couldn't adapt, and they died. And what you're describing happens a lot of the time. but then there's some of the cars come out without rust spots and they continue on.
Well, I mean, you can't see each rust event, but it's still continuous and destructive. And in the H1N1 virus that you're talking about, from what I'm saying, that would explain why the mortality rates went down, because we agreed that it did start off as a red hot pandemic, went to a whimper, went to an extinction event. But what they seen was that the virus started off more human in its codon usage, and then it ended up randomized. So what it did is it actually became worse at interacting with human DNA over time. And if it's using the wrong codons, Taylor, that means that it's going to be less efficient at replicating in human hosts. So that's exactly what's expected under a model of genetic entropy. But that model is predicted under an assumption of a biblical based model. So I mean, isn't that consistent with the model that I hold to, Taylor?
It might be, but to go back to your like rusty car analogy.
Yep.
So if this car just accumulates rust over time,
right?
Basically, to keep it analogous to biological evolution, you would have to have a car that was able to adapt and incorporate rust into its system. That's all it does. It just, all right, I'm rusty now, and it works with it.
Right.
Because rust to the cell, or damage, you would say, to the cell, it doesn't see as damage. Those are just the new conditions. So it can adapt to that. Rust on a car, you might think is bad, but if the car understands how to use rust, then it's a better car now in every way.
Well, I mean, I've seen 20-year-old cars that are still driving. You can get them safety, take them to the mechanics. They'll do what they can do. They're all rusted out, but that car is probably not going to last another 3 to 5 years. So sure, it's driving under the capabilities that it has. But like I said, just like each rust event is not seen
the cars
exactly.
don't replicate, so the analogy only goes so far, which is why I just described a magical car that could incorporate rust. But what cells do is incorporate what they have, and they just make random combinations and random changes, and it's slow, and it's it's 99% unsuccessful. But the 1% that does succeed ends up spreading all over the place.
But the thing is, these, like, even with genetic drift, these low impact deleterious mutations, they're immune to selection, and that's the problem. I think my position is just simply, these rare beneficial mutations that we're talking about, they cannot and will not compensate for the relentless influx of deleterious mutations. You're saying that they will, but you said earlier that this process of evolution, natural selection acting upon random variation, random mutation, it happens with lots of time, billions and billions of years. So that's why I say the evolutionists, they don't actually have a science. They hope, they dream, they imagine, but that type of evolution, Taylor, it really only happens in the imagination. It's kind of a faith, in my opinion, it's a faith-based science fiction religion, because it goes against everything that we know about empirical science. Because we just spent almost an hour talking about the degeneration of our genome, and you're saying that a few rare beneficial mutations, which I agree.
You can't tell me how much time we have left, though. So that does not go against the theory of evolution, because we can have both. We can have both evolving and devolving at the same time. We can have this long history of change in biodiversity, but they're still accruing these miniature mutations over time. We all might have it. That's unconfirmed. As far as explaining, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought on that, but
Well, are you familiar with the research? I mean, but we might just have to agree to disagree. I think I would like to just point out, but before we might switch topics slightly, I've pointed out extinction events in, obviously the H1N1 human virus, reductive evolution in all types of bacterial populations, extinction events based on increased genetic load in mammoths, populations in Homo Neanderthals, the hobbits. There's evidence that Homo erectus, Homo naledi experience reductive evolution. We see it in cheetah populations, butterfly populations, and we see it entropic degeneration, a pandemic in regards to cancers, autoimmune, immunological, asthma. I mean, we see it everywhere. And I think it's obvious that degeneration, the loss of information is not going to take your fish to fisherman, and a few rare beneficial mutations is not going to counterbalance the influx of deleterious mutations. So that's my position. If you want to say a couple last things, because I think at that point we're just going to agree to disagree. I think the evidence is on my side, and I think the evolutionists have to do a lot of imagining to ignore all that evidence. But what do you have to say to that, brother?
Well, it's interesting then that most of the scientists would agree with my conclusions, or rather, I would agree with theirs. But so the science is on the side of evolution, because your main criticism is that we weren't actually there to observe every specific little change, and we're just kind of assuming based on what our model would tell us, and that's just it. The model is based on mechanisms that we've proven in the laboratory. All these cellular mechanisms for selection, or for how the genes work and how the genome works, and all the selection pressures in natural selection. We know all these things happen, and we know how they happen exactly down to the molecule. And so when we have this theory, and it can explain things that we don't know. And while we didn't observe it, this is precisely how we solve crimes. If we go over, we find a dead body, there's a gun next to it, and there's gunpowder. We never saw anyone get shot, but we see a dead guy with a bullet in him. There's gunpowder. We know how guns work. It ejects the gunpowder and the bullet when it's fired. So it's the same thing with all the science.
Well, and that's why I say, the evolutionists have a nice science fiction, fairy tale on their hands, because I would say time is the god of the evolutionists, because you have to dream, you have to hope, you have to imagine that the degeneration and decay of prior information is actually going to take your fish to fisherman. So to look at this crime scene you're talking about, if what we know on an observable level is that these low impact, near neutral, deleterious mutations are actually destroying our information systems, but then you want to look back and conclude that your amoeba-like ancestor turned into a whale over billions of years. I mean, that's going to be incorrect.
I don't want to conclude it. We look at the biodiversity, and what we know of cellular mechanisms explains all of the biodiversity, unlike creation, because there's no explanation for God having created wasps that sometimes eat fruit, and some wasps that can only replicate by laying eggs in the brains of beetles. That is fully explainable by random mutations and natural selection.
Well, if we look to
why whales have hind legs inside of them.
Well, those
why would God
legs,
give them that?
Well, those hind legs, those apparent vestigial organs, are now known to be highly functional and important in sexual reproduction. But I think that type of evidence is just based on an ignorance of. So I'm not saying you're ignorant of science. I'm saying, like, in the past, what they assumed was useless, functionless type organs, and now through further scientific investigation. So I think in the past, for example, they had over 140 vestigial organs, And now, I mean, we can sit here and argue over 2 or 3 possibly, but due to scientific advancement, and even ENCODE, I'm curious your thoughts on that. You know, they found that at least 80% of the non-coding DNA was transcribed into RNA, suggesting function. So the trajectory of discovery that we see now, based on the accumulating papers that discuss new functions in these regions, favors genome-wide functionality. And one other thing I want to say is, you know, we're just beginning, Taylor, to understand the developmental process. You know, how coding and non-coding DNA coordinate when, where, and how, say, structures are sequentially put in place to produce a fully functional organism. I mean, in 9 months, you know, a single-celled embryo into a fully human being. And comprehensive knockout experiments for a mammal, I'm sure you're aware of this, have not yet been performed. So that the chances of genome-wide functionality are pretty strong. So where's the evolutionary leftovers from this process you're talking about? Because I think that goes right into the vestigial organ argument. I mean, do you agree that over 80% of our genome is functional?
Yeah, for most of it is non-coding, but a lot of the non-coding stuff has a regulatory function.
Yeah. So
but you can mess with the regulatory functions a lot and see very few effects. And in fact, that's one of the main differences between apes and humans. So I think you just asked about what do we see that's conserved between them? We see
over 50%.
We see certain genes only conserved after a certain time period. Especially in the fossil record, we can't test fossils for genes, but we know that genes encode for phenotypes. So for the molecular data that we do have, we see genes conserved among what the phylogeny predicted were close species. And we also use the molecular evidence to make the phylogeny more accurate.
See, here's the problem that I have with these phylogenies and these phylogenetic systematics, is that I'm not saying all of it, but a lot of it is based on a primary assumption, for one, that universal common ancestry is true. So any type of evidence that contradicts it, they'll just come up with a rescue device, say convergent evolution, for example. But it's also based on an assumption that most of our nuclear DNA differences or evolutionary leftovers or junk or you know, genomic fossils. But now,
are you aware of the phylogeny challenge from Aaron Ra?
Exactly. And the thing is, Aaron Ra assumes that these genetic markers he's using to build the phylogenetic trees are based on evolutionary leftovers. But what I said about junk DNA,
that is the best explanation.
Yeah, but the thing is, what we know about the fact that, you know, junk DNA has now been overturned and that most of our genome's functional.
That was more of like a media label. Scientists said we don't know what it does.
But I'm saying now that because you just said that this non-coding DNA is heavily involved in regulatory use, right? For the audience sake, that just means when and how fast to, say, make specific proteins, but also in embryonic development. You know,
so that's where most of the mutations would occur, and that's just up and down regulation, and that can easily be regulated by natural selection.
Well, are you familiar with, so if we look at like the phylogeny challenge or phylogenetic systematics, a lot of it, like there's specific genetic markers, ERVs, right, endogenous retroviruses. They'll use these, you can say shared mistakes. They'll use these to build the phylogenies. But now that most of this genome is now known to perform many valuable functions, that's consistent with a common design argument now, because now that's proof that they're not actually evolutionary leftovers. Because some of those pseudogenes that Aaron Ra uses to build his trees, they're actually now known, and you probably agree with this, they're necessary and required to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. So how do you explain all of the incoming data on genomic functionality. I mean, that contradicts these phylogenetic trees. How do you explain those?
So one reason that fits best is the likelihood of these mutations occurring the exact same in two different organisms is astronomically lower than you even think that the beneficial mutations are going to be.
Right, I agree.
And so we see organisms that have these shared heritages, and they're conserved. They're conserved among, maybe a type of fish, but not other fish. So why did some fish get it and some fish don't? Only these fish that all kind of look alike and share a common ancestry have the same thing. And so along the lines of like the phylogeny challenge is we would like you to point out at what point the dinosaur is no longer a dinosaur and it's just a bird, and at what point a limbless lizard is a snake.
See, with the phylogeny,
at what point the first snakes were snakes.
Because with the phylogeny challenge, what I'm saying in regards to, because we looked at created kinds. So let me just explain briefly, because what I said is these phylogenetic systematic charts are based on the assumption that a lot of this genome is functionally useless. So these shared pseudogenes, which were largely assumed to be genetic mistakes, but now we see that a lot of them are being overturned and shown to be functional. That's consistent with our model of what's called created heterozygosity hypothesis. And what it is if we have heterozygous ancestors, so it's just a fancy word for pre-existing genetic diversity, because we believe God created based on his command to be fruitful and multiply. He didn't want Adam and Eve to reproduce by cloning. That wouldn't make any sense. So with these pre-existing DNA differences, an almost limitless variety of combinations of chromosomes, genes, and traits are then possible. So we look to, Taylor, recombination gene conversion, and what those processes would do would provide many new varieties of combinations of traits quickly, since the differences are already built in. So that's how we explain speciation. We expect speciation, we predict speciation, but there are limits. Now, here's our testable prediction. If God, because a lot of people say, well, that's an ad hoc explanation. Oh, God created Adam and Eve and the created kinds with pre-existing functional DNA differences. Well, here's the thing. That hypothesis makes testable and falsifiable predictions. So we predict that if this is true, the majority of our DNA differences, say nuclear, mitochondrial DNA differences, will be functional. And now what we know about the genome based on ENCODE, based on the accumulating papers indicating function, this is a confirmation of the model. So now these phylogenetic trees are being torn down because these genetic markers, these pseudogenes, these shared mistakes are now consistent with our model of pre-existing heterozygosity. Does that make sense?
A little bit. Because I don't understand why. So you fully admit that there's microevolution going on.
Well, I think microevolution is a bad term to use, but I mean, the evolutionists are using it. It's common. It's a common term. Marvel used it, but because.
So but you don't even need mutation really for speciation.
Yes.
Obviously, it's going to help to have different proteins, but theoretically, how long would it take for you to call something a different species? At what point is a limbless lizard a snake? Does it join the snake kind? Or at what point is, if I breed bears into the small little hamster thing, at what point is it no longer a bear?
Right, and that's a good question. And based on what you said proves that you're listening. So that's really good, because mutations are only going to provide a small amount of variety. So you're right. We actually look to the pre-existing built-in genetic diversity, or in other words, pre-existing heterozygosity and recombination and gene conversion, which are not mutation related. So based on this allelic variety, allelic potential, visible distinctiveness in offspring is going to be rapid. Okay, so we acknowledge that organisms often change over time, right? Microevolution, variations within a kind, but these are limited to the created kind. So I'm getting to your to your answer, because speciation, say these similar organisms are isolated from one another, and these DNA differences accumulate until these populations, say they become incapable of interbreeding, for example, speciation has then occurred. So we've made a testable prediction not only on functional DNA differences, which has been confirmed, but also on speciation rates. So there's a new paper out just recently in regards to finches, and there has been observed finch populations that in observed time have gone from shifts in heterozygosity, so heterozygous DNA sites, to homozygous DNA sites, which we predict, of course, based on pre-existing heterozygosity, and new species, new distinct species of these finches have been observed. So there's a couple papers on that, and that's another confirmation of our model. So in regards to your question on created kinds, we would look to, so we say family level is so whatever I choose, if I choose the species level, the genus level, it needs, testable predictions need to flow from it. That's the gold standard of the science. So we look to the family level. Now we're going to look to functionally unique DNA differences across certain families, because obviously they don't share ancestry. So that's the only way that we can fully answer the phylogeny challenge. We have some answers, say orphan genes, which are taxonomically restricted. But the more we learn about the DNA language, because we only understand less than 5% of the DNA language, we're in the infancy of understanding the DNA language. So the more we learn about it, the more that our model is confirmed, and the more that the evolutionary model is actually being falsified for many reasons. Go ahead.
So do you accept that birds are dinosaurs?
No, I wouldn't, because like I said,
tell me which line along dinosaur to bird evolution, which one was the first bird?
see, the thing is, for me to answer that question, I'd have to assume that universal common ancestry is true, but based on everything I talked about, it's not.
You just have to be able to draw a hard and fast line between them, and you can't, because the gradual change is so slow that no matter which direction you go, you will see gradual change, which you can't draw a hard and fast line on.
No, because
and that's the phylogeny challenge.
But the thing is, the phylogeny challenge is fallacious. For one, it assumes universal common ancestry is true. So it's kind of more so a challenge for R and Raw. But the thing is, our model, our hypothesis that makes testable predictions created heterozygosity, we're now seeing functionally unique DNA differences separating families. So that's how we can understand, and also based on inbreeding and we can understand what's related and what's not. And we can actually conclude that the monkey kind, or say the ape kind, is different than the human kind. So, I mean, there's your two distinct created kinds if you really want.
So what is your criteria for that barrier?
The criteria for the barrier would be,
when is a long-necked horse just a giraffe?
See, the thing is, a lot of what you're saying, say a giraffe and a horse, we have to look at DNA differences, because obviously, you know, this being a cell biologist, these phylogenetic trees and charts, they're built by sequencing genes, say mitochondrial genes, for example. So like I said, we're looking at, because I'm not sure if you've ever watched the Dr. Herman Mayes versus Ken Hovind debate. Herman Mayes asked, what type of testable predictions can you make based on neutral variation? And that's because, based on the assumption of universal common ancestry, those DNA differences, since they share relationships, they're going to be functionally neutral. But we predict that they're going to be functionally unique, because obviously they're not related. So I'm trying to tell you, I might not have every answer to what is a created kind, what is shared ancestry, but what we now know about the DNA is slowly confirming that, because we're looking to functionally unique DNA differences. You guys are looking to functionally neutral DNA differences. But I do want to say this. It's been exactly an hour. It's been longer than an hour. I'm going to let you have the final words here. Sum everything up on what you think. I think it's been a good discussion. And then I got something to do. I'm going to leave it as a free-for-all if you want, just to kind of talk about random stuff. I think there's a couple guys in the chat, and kind of go from there. So I'll leave it to you to say whatever you got to say, brother. Go ahead.
All right. Well, you say that they are distinct, but we can actually make connections between these different kinds. There are transitional forms, and this is just part of the problem. Is we understand that there is no hard and fast line. There is no criteria. There's not a set of DNA that says, "Welp, I'm a different kind now." I don't understand where these barriers are coming from. And so, like, when is a long-necked horse just a giraffe? Giraffe. Speaking of giraffes, I think you've probably heard of this example, but the vagus nerve is a pretty convincing evidence that creation science is not consistent with what we see in reality, because it's a nerve that goes all the way down its neck and back up its neck, which would have no function. It's just that way because it's related to other things that have a shorter neck, and the nerve got tangled up basically, and so it keeps its same position while the neck elongates throughout evolution. And it's just these kind of continuations that have no break between all the kinds that's very convincing on the phylogeny. And I guess I'll just close out by kind of saying, you guys admit to all these micro changes, but you just kind of assume, it seems like, this barrier that somehow knows when the kind needs to stop changing or when to redirect it so that it doesn't become something that's too different. Because let's take language, for example. It changes only a slight bit at a time, but you give it enough time and it's going to look completely different. It's going to be unintelligible to the people who spoke it just a few hundred years ago. And the same with biological evolution. You add enough changes, it doesn't matter how small they are. It will be different eventually. So that's kind of the position of evolutionists.
Well, I appreciate your. I'll just say a couple last words there. I appreciate your kind of concluding statement there. Like I said, and we agreed at the beginning, we don't disagree with natural selection, mutations. We don't agree. We don't disagree that evolution in regards to biological evolution means a change in allele frequency or a change in gene pool in populations over generations. It has to do with the limits to the change in the direction of the change. So it was my my position that neo-Darwinism, these mechanisms, they lack significant creative powers in regards to obviously anatomical novelty, novel information, phenotypic complexity, but it all came down to beneficial mutations. It all came down to a net loss versus a net gain. And I think it's clear that beneficials cannot keep up with the influx of deleterious mutations and these near neutrals that Taylor and I talked about. I think it's also quite evident that they are going to be virtually unstoppable. So if natural selection has no way to stop the accumulating damage, nor the ability to obviously build a genome based on that, I think, like I said many times, that type of evolution, the pond scum to people type of evolution, that only happens in the imagination of those that actually want to believe in it. And even in regards to the linkage groups that we talked about, that seems to be a killer and a destroyer for particles to people type evolution, because every linkage block is degenerate. So the transitional fossils he talks about are an appeal to the fossil record. Fossils, they're just circumstantial evidence requiring an actual mechanism to explain that type of large-scale evolutionary change. So what we know about observable genomic data, we can safely conclude that that it's false, which means whether it's phylogenetic systematics, any other type of evidence, it's being used, and it's based on a false assumption that universal common ancestry is true. But since we know it's not true, it's more so a circular argument. So that would be my my conclusion there. And also, I want to thank Taylor for being respectful. It was fun, actually. That hour and 10 minutes really flew by.
Yeah.
I think it would be good for us to even do another one because there's just so much to talk about. I think the gold standard of science is testable predictions. So I think I've provided a couple of hypotheses that make testable predictions. So if that's the gold standard of science, maybe next time we can focus even more on testable predictions. So standing for truth and Taylor's portion of the debate is over. It's been fun. It's been great. We'll do it again. I'm going to mute myself and leave it for maybe just some banter back and forth between you guys. Just want to make sure everything's respectful from here on out. And thanks again, guys. Take it over.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so
Hey.
oh hey, does anyone want to have any questions or anything? Jeremy or Matt? Or...
I haven't listened to much of what they talked about because I was busy. But is Taylor who's that again? Taylor, is he still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes. Okay. I would like to ask you about the giraffe thing that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know that certain examples like the giraffe that you mentioned, there are many examples like that which we cannot explain right before, which now has an explanation. Do you know that?
I'd like to hear the explanation.
No. I'm not saying that. I'm not sure if the giraffe example that you gave already has been explained by science of why it is the way it is. Okay, but I'm just saying that there are many examples of things that that we didn't understand before. Okay, that were used to use as proof for evolution that have now been overturned. For example, I'll just mention the most popular one used by Richard Dawkins. The eye. He said the wires are in front. Correct. Do you know about this, Taylor?
I think I've watched that. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Actually, that is one of the most popular examples given by evolutionists that prove bad design, just like what you mentioned about the giraffe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but at first that was so hard to overcome for creationists, but now it's completely overturned. It is no longer actually eye experts have now unanimously agreed that the wires or the nerves at the front of the eye is actually an incredible design. They actually criticize Richard Dawkins for this. So Taylor, I just want you to be open-minded and think and put a slight benefit of a doubt to the concept of creation, because there are many evidences like the one you mentioned, the giraffe, that have been overturned, almost 100 of them in span of 100 years. Like
well,
the
I
eye
have
example.
which doctors or which scientists overturned the eye thing? Why were they saying it's a good design to have nerves in your eye? Because to my understanding, it was the blood vessels that was just occluding sharpness of the image.
I forgot all the details, but one of the data that I recall is that it relieves the pressure. Okay, it relieves the pressure of the blood that is moving toward the nerves in front. Okay, and one more thing regarding that, if it's really a bad design, why don't we see it? We see very well, right? We do see clearly.
There are
We do
creatures
see
with much better eyes than us, so there are better.
Yes, that's true. I agree, Taylor, that there are eyes like the lobster, right? Their eyes are better than ours, but it depends on the environment. Okay, there are also eagles. I'm not sure if it's eagles. Some flying creatures, their eyes are really greater than ours. They can see very far, correct?
Yeah.
Much better than ours. But but they need it. That's why their eyes are designed that way. They need to see very far. And lobsters in the aquatic environment need their type of eye to live in the aquatic environment. So it depends on the environment. It's true, it's more complex, but it depends upon the environment. So God would have designed it that way in a specific environment, correct? Hang on.
I mean, that's explained by evolution too. You wouldn't need greater eyesight to survive if you're a human. But if God was designing us, he would give us a design that was not just sufficient, it would be good. We would have great eyesight. I could use better eyesight. That would be a better design for me. Humanity could probably be a few leaps forward if we could see better.
Actually, our eye, the capability.
So that actually is more consistent with the evolutionary model.
Actually, the way I see it, I'm a former atheist, by the way, former evolutionist. The eye, the way I see it, creation and evolution both are predicting the same thing about the eye example that we are talking about. You can make your case, and we can make our case. So since we can also make our case, I encourage you, hopefully, you give creation benefit of a doubt. I'm not telling you to believe in creation.
I don't understand the mechanisms of creation because there are no rules. It's just kind of God made it that way because he felt like it. Because if it was design, he wouldn't merely just have things that were sufficient. They would be superior designs than what come up with.
They are superior designs. I mean, our eyes are more complex than the camera. We have more pixels, correct?
For example, what is the creationist explanation of why we don't have better eyesight? Since we can have better eyes, what's the excuse?
I would imagine because as frugivores, we need color. It's more important than, say, a hawk that needs to see really, really far. Humans only get degenerative eye problems from things like cataracts, glaucoma, and things like that because we mess ourselves up. The eye usually tends to have defunctions because of things like fungus, which will build up in the eye because of there's fungus in the blood, and because the eye actually gets circulation through the blood from the back of it. If your blood is bad, then your eyesight's going to start to go bad. So what usually happens is boxers get trauma on one side of their eye because if they're right-handed, they get hit in the left eye a little bit more often, and they get cataracts. It's like an onion, so one part gets cracked and it goes from there. But all of these, as you noticed, are degenerative. They're problems that start out. Some kids have like a degenerative genetic problem or disposition to having some type of problem, but overall the human eye is pretty good. I only know people that have problems with it because of something they've actually done. So we just need our eyesight because we're frugivores, so we would normally want to see a large variety of colors to pick fruit that's ripe. So it's exactly what we would want from our eyes. We don't need shark eyes because we don't live in the ocean, for example.
Well, I'm not sure if what the trade-off is if you're a hawk. I don't know what colors I see or not. But so, I mean, I get that there could be specific reasons, but I'm just not seeing any mechanism that is any principles that we can actually extrapolate. So, like, what's the mechanism for viruses and diseases in the creationist model?
What do you mean mechanism? What's the origin? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, what's the function? Why are they there?
Actually, the Bible said humans sin, correct? So, sin, because of sin, God cursed all creation. That's why we have viruses and so on. That's the answer.
And
that's why everything.
So little children need to get leprosy and have their flesh rot away because Adam ate a fruit?
I cannot answer that. It's just part of the generation.
That's why it's not a satisfying explanation.
How can we explain the origin of this virus scientifically?
Scientifically, we can explain it.
I want to mention real quick. I'm really interested in bacteria and viruses, and the discussion came up. I was going to post for you, Taylor, this article I wrote. It's got some sources that I'm going to post it in the group chat for the Hangout. It talks about bacteria, viruses, and why they're evidence for design. It's pretty lengthy, so I'm not really going to. I mean, I've read some of it before, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. But I'm going to post it there, so if you want to read that later, you can. Hold on.
Taylor, I kind of heard you and Standing for Truth talk about the beneficial mutations. I don't know. I didn't hear much, so forgive me. But I would like to ask you a question. You said, as I recall, you can correct me if I'm wrong. You said that the beneficial mutations are one of the keys to evolution, correct? But that's not the only mechanism. We know there's also gene duplication, correct?
Correct.
Now, yes. Right now, there are 3 to 6 billion DNA letters in the human genome, correct? So my question to you is, how many beneficial mutations per year do we need to achieve 3 billion DNA letters in just 3 billion years in evolutionary history? If you want, you can also add the number of gene duplications to help the beneficial mutation numbers.
I don't know.
Because
calculations.
Sorry.
I assume you have some calculations.
No, I'm asking you if you have some calculations, because it is your burden. It is the evolutionist's burden to give those numbers, because because science is about testable and falsifiable predictions and retrodictions at the same time. And I'm asking for retrodiction numbers. And if because this is a beneficial mutation and gene duplication thing is a is some of the most important evolutionary mechanisms for adding new information, correct? So since this is very important, evolution should be able to make testable and falsifiable and retrodictions to this. Okay, so I'm asking you, do you have a retrodiction numbers to answer my questions? Because if evolution cannot give these numbers, then evolution cannot be considered science, because science is about making these numbers.
No, because we've proven evolution in other ways, and we don't need to do that because the fact that DNA can actually copy itself and duplicate is explanation enough. Because the question is, how do we get more nucleotides? How does the genome expand? How do we get new information to work with? Well, there are several mechanisms. We don't need to have observed it, just like we don't need to have observed the bullet come out of the gun, because we know bullets come out of guns. So if we see an empty gun with a dead guy next to it, it's just simple deductive reasoning. We know the mechanism and we see the results. There's no reason to believe otherwise.
Sorry, Taylor. I don't think you are getting my question. Sorry, I'm not very good in English, so please bear with me. What I'm asking is, how many, for example, how many beneficial mutations do we need, okay, per year to achieve to achieve 3 billion DNA letters in 3 billion years? Okay, evolution loves to use uniformitarianism, correct? So based on the amount of beneficial mutations happening today, extrapolate it into the past. That's why you need to give us numbers.
They don't
because
happen
if
in
you're
regular intervals.
Sorry,
they don't happen in regular intervals. Bacteria mutate very quickly.
no, don't worry.
Other animals don't.
No, for the ones that we can only observe today, your best beneficial mutation example in a population, you can give it to us to the scientific community, and then use those numbers to extrapolate towards evolutionary history, and then you can give us the numbers.
No, because mutations are random.
Yes, but we have those mutation rates, correct? We have those beneficial mutations, right? It does happen, and in some cases it happens in a population. So those mutation rates and those number of beneficial mutations, extrapolate them into the past and give us the numbers. How many do we need per year? And if those numbers do not fit,
it's not going to be very accurate.
Yeah, at
No one
least
would
at
do
least,
that.
at least some testable predictions and that we can falsify too. Or if evolution can't do that, then it cannot be considered science because
Um,
it's about testable and falsifiable predictions.
it
No, it's
doesn't have
okay.
to answer all questions, but it definitely answers a lot of questions. It may not answer
Yes.
that question, but that's kind of a nonsense question because mutations happen at different rates.
Yes, but we do have an average for those mutations, and they do not. The rates
can't
do not vary so huge, so largely. They're just in range.
you
We
can't
could.
extrapolate that across all organisms, though. I mean, it's just you could do it. It's just I don't see what problem would that solve. What information is that going to be useful for?
No, it's one way to because this has never been done before in the evolutionary literature.
It's not
I
a
mean,
question anyone cares about, though.
because they cannot answer it. That's why they don't make the numbers. This is very important. This is one of your top three mechanisms. This is
Well,
beneficial mutations we're talking about.
there are questions that physics can't address either. Sciences are constantly evolving. Just because it can't answer one question that you've cherry picked out doesn't say anything about the questions that it can answer.
Oh no.
I just want to butt in real quick. I would
This
say, I would say based on what Jeremy's saying. Sorry, Jeremy, real quick, because even our portion of the debate, Taylor, had a lot to do with whether or not one or two rare beneficial mutations can counterbalance the accumulating damage of low impact deleterious mutations. So Jeremy's asking for numbers because you said it's a numbers game. So if this type of evolution is true, it needs to make testable and falsifiable predictions, or else, as Jeremy said, it's now pseudoscience. So you would have to provide those numbers if you want us to believe that it's empirically scientific, or else it's just pseudoscience without the numbers. Because anybody can just say, hey, beneficials happen. It's going to counterbalance the accumulating damage. Universal common ancestry is true, but it's just fallacious without the actual numbers. Are you able to provide him the numbers at all?
No, because it makes other predictions. I don't need to predict that. The theory of evolution was meant to predict other things.
But in this case, Taylor, it's mostly about retrodictions. Okay, retrodictions. So if evolution is so obvious, then the numbers should be easy to make also. But anyway, never mind.
Those numbers wouldn't provide us answers for anything, though. What do you think that would solve?
Sorry?
What do you think that would solve if we knew how many mutations that it took to get here?
It will provide a big evidence for evolution, another evidence for evolution, right?
No, because you're just at that point you would just say you're just using evolution to prove evolution. If I'm just calculating things based on the theory of evolution.
Oh, okay, never mind. But this is, like I said, this is one of your top three mechanisms, and evolutionists cannot make predictions, retrodictions, nothing. So well, anyway, may I ask you, are you an open-minded person?
Yeah.
May I ask you, how did sexual reproduction evolve? Please give me empirical evidence how the organs from each sex evolve and having foresight of the other sex organs without using evolutionary guesses. And if you can, give me testable and falsifiable prediction of this. So, like you said, you're open-minded.
So without using evolutionary evidence, I have to tell you.
Oh yeah. Can you explain, at least a guess, how sexual reproduction evolved? Sorry. Yeah. How the organs of the male and the female had foresight over each other's organs about to evolve in evolutionary history.
Well, so the simplest animals that we know of are hermaphroditic, and they still need well, the simplest did not need a mating partner. I don't think they just clone themselves.
Asexual.
Yeah. But for worms, a lot of them are hermaphroditic, so they require a sexual partner, but they're both the same sex. So really all it had to do was basically lose one of those functions, because worms have the ability to inseminate each other. So really, loss of information, supposed degradation, can actually lead to a progression of the animal. And
yeah, Taylor. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, you were saying. Sorry.
No, I think I was done.
Yeah. What you just said is not empirical evidence at all. It's a guess. Do you agree? It's a guess.
You asked for a guess.
Yes, it's a. Oh, can you give me empirical evidence?
I'm not specifically aware of any.
Yeah, there is none. I asked you before this that if you're open-minded, what if science can never explain sexual reproduction ever? What if?
Then we don't explain it. It's a mystery. It doesn't
Okay.
mean therefore God.
Are you open-minded? Yes, you said yes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So will you put a little benefit of a doubt that it's God? Just a little. You don't need to believe it's God. Maybe evolution. Maybe God used evolution. You can believe that.
Yeah, I don't know. It just means I don't know.
But you said you're open-minded. So can you put a little benefit of a doubt that God may have did it? Just little benefit of a doubt, 1%.
Which
Even
God?
Richard Dawkins. Sorry.
Which God?
Well, the creator of the universe.
Can you provide any
Just
evidence
like
for that? Any empirical evidence? Any science?
that what? God
That
of the
a God
universe?
exists?
So, God of the universe?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There are tons of evidence, hundreds of them in cosmology. Since we're talking about the universe, do you know what the first verse of the Bible said? That it said that the universe had a beginning. Correct. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. This has been the position of theists all along.
Well,
But
it
atheists,
says in Spider-Man comics that Spider-Man lives in New York.
yeah, but we're talking about the universe. So yeah, but here's the
So
thing,
the book
Taylor.
isn't evidence of anything, though.
No, it's like this, Taylor. The theists have always maintained that the universe had a beginning because it's from the Bible. So this is our testable and falsifiable prediction. Okay, when I say theist, it's not just young Earth creationists. It's also old Earth creationists and theistic evolutionists. Okay, this has always been maintained in the history of mankind, that the universe had a beginning. But the other side, the atheists, have always wanted the universe to be eternal. Okay, because they don't want there to be a God. Okay, but in the 20th century, we have already conclusively proven that the universe had a beginning. Okay, so as you
Well,
can
are
see,
you assuming that I don't want there to be a God?
sorry, you don't want there to be a God?
Are you assuming that I don't want that?
No, I'm not. I'm saying many atheists don't want there to be a God. That's why they're biased. That is why when every time when new evidence of God comes, they develop rescuing devices. Like for example, actually during the 60s, as you know, Dr. Sir Fred Hoyle and other physicists have been postulating eternal universe theories, correct? But they were all debunked, okay, by evidence that the universe had a beginning. Stephen Hawking helped prove it, okay? But after they proved that the universe had a beginning, okay, which fits the Bible, and they don't like it to fit into the Bible, they have to develop another theory to explain away this beginning. And that's where the multiverse comes in. You heard of the multiverse?
Yeah, but how did you prove that the universe began?
Because a beginning requires a beginner. Sorry, you're talking about the science. The law of entropy, for example. Everything is in the universe is dying. Stars are losing their fuel, and so on. As and the universe is getting colder and colder as the universe expands.
Doesn't seem
Okay.
like a good design to me.
Huh? What do you mean? What do you mean not good design? The expansion?
A good design would be able to be maintained.
What? I'm sorry, I'm not understanding. Maintain what?
Maintain its own integrity. The universe is constantly degrading. A good
Oh yeah,
design would not do that,
because
especially
because because for example, we built cars, right? Cars also do degrade, correct? And cars have a creator. We are the creator of cars. So the universe, okay, was once perfectly wounded up, and then as time goes on, it will degenerate. Second law of thermodynamics, correct?
yeah.
So if the universe had a beginning, there has to be a beginner to the universe. Plus, the
But
Bible
what's the
predicted.
beginning of the universe?
Sorry.
Do you think the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe?
If you're an old Earth creationist, yeah, you can go for the Big Bang. And if you're a young Earth creationist, you can go for something else. I can go for the Big Bang. I can
Well,
go.
there was something before the Big Bang. It just exploded. So I don't see where anyone has proved the beginning of whatever existed before the Big Bang.
Yeah,
Well,
but
the idea that there was something prior to the Big Bang posits there was something prior to that, and prior to that, and prior to that, and prior to that, and that
Everything
it results in an infinite regression.
Mhm.
But that creates a logical contradiction. Let me
Same
give
with
you one. For example, if time existed infinitely into the past, how many seconds are there in an infinite number of seconds? The answer is infinite. See, it creates a logical contradiction, and
Mhm.
therefore the premise can't be true. In
So
science and philosophy, hold on, anything that creates a logical contradiction can't be considered true. So, because the idea of an eternally existing physical reality creates a logical contradiction, and I think the reason it does that is because God created the universe at a moment in time in the past, and it had an absolute beginning, and therefore we don't need a logical contradiction. But the fact that it produces a logical contradiction tells us, and if we adhere to the truths of philosophy and science, that it can't be true. So there has not been, according to the philosophy of science, there has not been an infinite regression of material causes. Physical reality cannot be infinitely existing into the past.
so
What do you think of that?
if God created things at a moment in time, you're subject to that same problem because that moment in time will never arrive.
No,
Because
that wouldn't be an infinite regression. See, that would be a moment in time when everything came into existence from absolutely nothing. But to
believe
believe that
that
there
about
is an
God, but not about anything else.
well,
You make
but
a special
well, I
exception.
mean, no, okay, so I'm special pleading. I'm fine with that. But the point I'm making is, I don't have a logical.
Done.
Oh, I don't have a logical. I don't have a. No, we're not done. I don't have a logical contradiction involved in my belief. And science actually supports the idea that the universe came into existence from absolutely nothing at a moment in the past. Entropy verifies that for us. If entropy applies to all material substrates, all. So everywhere there is a thing that's physical, entropy is a fact. Energy is constantly being distributed and dispersed and becoming more and more evenly distributed. That is a fact. That's a law. In fact, that's the second law of thermodynamics. That's a law of science. So if material reality infinitely existed into the past, entropy would be going on infinitely in the past. And what that means is then the universe would have experienced absolute entropy infinitely long ago. And that means the universe right now that we're in would be absolutely dead, dark, and black. There would be no light, no potential work could be done, no usable energy, and you and I couldn't be sitting here talking. Give that a thought.
Same with God. He would have to wait for the same infinite time. And
God is
entropy-
not a material thing. See.
all right. Do you have any scientific proof of that?
No, I have philosophical arguments for it.
Right.
But Taylor, you also have to, sorry.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
You were saying, no, Taylor was saying something.
I was just gonna reiterate, God is subject to the exact same infinite regress problem as the universe is. Because if everything needs a creator, if everything needs a cause, you're special pleading if you make that exception for God, and that is a logical fallacy. And so I cannot accept that as an argument.
But wait, you're
Okay.
appealing to things that are not observed.
Hold on, guys.
Uh,
What are you saying, Jeremy?
sorry. Taylor, regarding that, it's actually simple. Okay. The universe is time and space, correct? So, time and space are linked together. It means outside the universe, there is no time and space. Okay, there is no time and space outside the universe because the universe we live in right now is time and space. So if there is no time and space outside the universe, no time, okay, no time. What does it mean? What does outside of the universe mean? It's eternal, correct? Okay, so only something eternal can create time. Okay, so that's all. Sorry, Neff.
Well, see, that's why I think that's the best explanation, because like this is one of the most popular videos that Kent Hovind talking about the creator of God, like an ultimate creator, has to be beyond, above and beyond what he's created. Like he's beyond time, beyond matter. That way he can tinker with it as he sees fit. And to me, that's just the best explanation for the creation of the universe. But go ahead, Neff.
I really don't want to, kind of. I don't want to speak a whole lot. I want you guys to have fun talking. I tend to dominate conversations. Everybody knows that. But I just would point out that, if you believe in an infinite regress of prior material causes, I think that it's an excuse for refusing to accept that the universe came into existence at some point in the past from absolutely nothing, because that sounds an awful lot like biblical creation. And that's exactly the reason that so many secular astronomers have argued against it and fabricated all kinds of theories, is to get around the fact that everything points to a biblical creation account. The universe absolutely did come into existence at a point in the past from absolutely nothing. I hate it that I have to clarify what I believe by saying absolutely nothing. I point that out. I shouldn't have to do that. All I should have to say is nothing. But evolutionists, kind of squeeze creationists into a position where they have to clarify that what they mean by and nothing is, well, nothing. So we say absolutely nothing. But certain secular scientists like Andrei Valenkin, a world-class astronomer, as well as Arno Panzias, astrophysicists, have acknowledged that their ideas of an understanding of the universe point to an absolute beginning from absolutely nothing. Now, the problem is they admit that doesn't seem like it can be true to me, they'll say, because they don't want to believe it. They'll say, they're secular astronomers and astrophysicists, and they'll say, well, that just can't be true because we know that uniformitarianism is correct. So what we find is a crazy contradiction that these secular astronomers and astrophysicists, cosmologists rather, will say, it looks like the evidence says the universe came into existence from absolutely nothing at some point in the past because of the second law of thermodynamics, for one thing, and the avoidance of the logical contradictions created by an infinite regress of some prior material substrate. And they'll say in their own papers and books, it looks like the universe came into existence from nothing, and that's what the evidence seems to say. But we know that can't be true. And that's the weird thing that we get from the secular scientific community is they'll acknowledge the evidence seems to point one direction, but they'll say, well, that just can't be true. It's because of their philosophy. It's not because of science, you see. It's because of their philosophy. So what do you think about that?
Well, I thought it was a creationist thing to say something cannot come from nothing. I thought that was your guys' position. So I guess I'm wrong about that. And as for the bias, I don't see why most people are suffering from that bias. And I don't see why actual scientists would suffer from a bias of just wanting the world to be godless. They're trying to find explanations. God did it is not an explanation. So
But Taylor, many scientists have admit that they will only accept natural explanation. If something goes against a naturalistic explanation, they will just explain it away.
well, what's an unnaturalistic explanation?
Design, evidence of design. It means
But if you can
there's
prove
a
it,
design.
it's natural.
No, there are limits to those explanations. Okay, there are limits. You cannot even explain. Sorry, not you. The scientific community cannot even guess the evolution of sex. Or, for example, let's say the chaperone protein. Do you know the chaperone protein?
Yeah.
Yes. Right? They cannot even
Mhm.
guess how these things evolve. So, I'm not really asking
We can
anybody or you.
guess.
Yeah, you could guess, yes, but your guess could be wrong. Okay. Um, right. So, like I asked you, are you open-minded? You said yes. Are you willing to put a slight benefit of a doubt that God did it? Just a slight 1%, 2%. Even
Sure.
Richard Dawkins said he is 99.9% sure there is no God. It's
Yeah, why
incredible
not?
that he even, yeah,
You can prove it, I'll accept it.
yeah, design. All scientists unanimously agree that everything looks designed, but they say evolution was the designer. But we know there are other explanations to that. Evolution is not the only explanation.
Okay.
Scientists just
I don't
so,
agree that anything looks designed. I'm a scientist.
sexual reproduction does not look designed to you.
No. Maybe I can share a
So,
photo. There's all
for
kinds of
example,
animals that have all kinds of freaky sex determination. Crocodiles are determined by temperature. It looks like it's been random and mixed up over time. That's what it looks like to me.
Okay, I want to make
God,
sure we get to all the topics we're wanting to present. So, like Jeremy, go ahead and just conclude since Stings want me to moderate, and then I'm going to move on to kinds, and then Standing and Raw Matter going to discuss something. So go ahead and give your conclusion real quick, Jeremy.
for example, there are thousands upon thousands of examples of design. Okay. For example, we were talking about sex, right? Fertilization. This is the egg cell, correct? And this is the sperm. When the sperm penetrates the egg, there are many sperms that penetrate the egg, correct? But they don't get in. Only one is allowed, or two, if I'm not mistaken. So correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, if one of those sperm cells get in, okay, the egg cell has a mechanism which closes its doors to the other sperm because only one or two can be allowed inside. So how did the cell know how to do that? For example, I can go on forever with this evidence of design.
Well, the way that sex works today is obviously not the simplest version that was the original progenitor. It would have changed over time.
Yes, but
The
can you
simplest
explain?
explanation would be because if there was an error, that thing would just never be born or it would die. But
So,
I mean, that's
but but
assuming the rest of the mechanisms.
but Taylor, don't you see there is a chicken and egg question here? Chicken and egg. Don't you see that? I mean, when I was
Eventually,
still an
but that's the question of abiogenesis, which evolution does not address.
no. This is not a biogenesis because this happened. Sexual evolution in evolutionary literature happened way after the evolution of the RNA protein DNA, RNA protein system. So this is not strictly an origin of life issue. Even Dr. Paul Davis, I think you heard of him, he said that evolution should also be able to answer abiogenesis, or else the all-important step one of evolution is not present. You cannot have a step one and jump to step two, correct?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's all.
Okay. So all right. Is that it, Jeremy?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I was gonna move on. I know the topic of kinds came up during the discussion. But Taylor, like, if you were a young Earth creationist or any type of creationist, like, what would your definition of a kind be? I mean, it's not a loaded question or anything. I'm just wondering, like, what you would say.
Well, this is one of the problems. I actually give this serious consideration. I'm try to be open-minded. I can't define what a kind would be because I don't understand where the barriers would be.
Well, I mean, I do understand that because I mean, it is something that a lot of creationists have thought about. Also, like, I have one of the things that I have looked into is like how much is variation dependent. I'm trying to think of how to word this. Like, I've concluded that some kinds have more built-in variation and variability than others, and that's how I kind of categorize things. I know that it can get a little murky at times, but, like, for instance, there's an article that came out a few years ago, and you know what glyptodonts are, don't you? The extinct mammal.
I think I've heard of them. Which ones are they?
They're like an extinct shelled mammal that they put them in, like, I think they lived in South America mostly.
Like the giant armadillo kind of things?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they had did a DNA. They analyzed their DNA and were saying that they were basically just giant armadillos, and that armadillos and glyptodonts, they appeared around the same time. So I take that to mean that they would be of the same kind, even though there's a huge amount of genetic variability, like with the glyptodont, the standard 9-banded armadillo, and then the tiny pink fairy armadillo. And that's what I get from it. I think that some kinds there's more built-in variability, and then I have another example I use is like the Meganeura, which is like the extinct giant dragonfly. I mean, there's some physical differences between that and modern dragonflies, but it's not as drastic as like the glyptodont armadillo. So one thing that I think that creationists do also is they kind of simplify the issue and treat it as more black and white. Because I think that it is kind of murky because I don't know. I think that the variability and the limits depend on the individual kind, and that there's not like one general broad rule.
You can probably look at it from a symbiotic relationship, like what came first, the fig wasp or the fig tree. For example, you can't have one without the other. You can't have the acacia tree without the ants that live on the acacia tree for it to survive. So I would imagine if they were to come about at the same time, it would make more logical sense. So when you have a lot of different variations in something, for example, let's take a bear. We know that there's the black bear, the brown bear, the polar bear, and there's a lot of current bears. But when they track genetically back, they can only find a bear called the short-faced bear as the original type of a bear. They can't go past that to another type of an animal or another species or anything that this short-faced bear came from. They just find a bear every time. So I would imagine a created kind would be the short-faced bear. So that would be an example.
Okay. Do you have a response to that, Taylor? Or?
Yeah, you can connect bear morphology beyond just bears, and that's the point.
But there's one thing I agree about what Taylor said, that creationists have not successfully sorted out the kinds yet. Okay, this is still an experiment creationists are currently doing. But we already but the good thing here is that we have clues. Okay, there are two clues. First, Taylor, are you aware of the recent article that 100,000 species arose recently?
Yeah.
Yes. Actually, in that article, it uses the barcodes, correct? I think we're familiar with the barcoding. Um, Along those barcodes, we also found certain genetic borderlines, which prevents one kind from changing into another. This is just preliminary, so I cannot really use this as slam dunk evidence. But that's one. That's one of the clues. And the other clue is breeding tests. Breeding tests. Creationists are doing breeding tests among what we suspect are the created kinds. So far, all of the expectations of creationists of which kind, which species are part of a kind when we breed them, they're always breedable. Is breedable the correct English? Like that. So, but we have clues. So I encourage you to be open-minded. Give us a
Okay.
benefit of a doubt. So we
Okay.
have, yeah, sorry.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna try to move on to next other questions because I don't want to waste too much time. I know Standing had mentioned that Raw Matt wanted to discuss epigenetics. Matt, do you want to bring that up or say anything about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, thanks. Because a big portion of Taylor and I's discussion the first hour, we talked a lot about, what's beneficial, what's deleterious, for example. But I know a lot of the so-called, beneficial mutations that evolutionists bring up are actually now known to be epigenetic changes, epigenetic related. Did you want to touch on that, Matt? And maybe you and Taylor can kind of go back and forth a bit.
Yeah, sure. I always ask people, give to me an example of a beneficial mutation in humans. And so far, they've always given me bone increased density. They've given me the Milano. They give me the Sherpa's high altitude and the lactose mutation and the HIV. Every single one of those is an epigenetic regulation where the switch is turned on, and the gene already had those propensities inside of them, and the genes actually did multiple functions, and they had irreducible complexity occur, and now they only do one function that's been boosted because of epigenetics. And epigenetics only expresses what a gene does. It doesn't add information whatsoever. So all of the beneficial mutations that they've actually found are not a beneficial mutation at all. They're just they can't be called a mutation because it wasn't a mutation that actually caused it. It was just a gene switch, essentially. So if they've lost every single beneficial mutation because of epigenetics, then I guess they're going to have to invoke some type of new theory or find beneficial mutations in another species. And so far, even in bacteria, when the Linsky's experiment, they backed them into corners by different temperature, different diets, different environments, and they genetically adapted really, really quickly to their environments, real fast. They evolved into that area. And what they found is that they weren't beneficial mutations, they were just epigenetic regulations. And a matter of fact, they genetically adapted so quickly to that environment, when they tried to put them back into the originals, they can't go. They have forced themselves into a corner almost. So they express their mutation, as you can call it, their epigenetic switch. Since they've turned it on, they're backed into that corner, and they can no longer get back out without massive problems, for example. So I guess that would be the best way to explain it.
Yeah, well, mutations are by far not the driver of evolution. The major driver of evolution is the epigenetic changes and natural selection. Mutations are very rare, but they do have a large impact when they occur.
Yeah, but the
clear one from different species. I'm not aware of any mutations in humans that occur. Like there's immune mutations. There's some people who are immune to I think there's even some people who are immune to AIDS, but there's people who are immune to Ebola. And you can pass that on. Right,
but that's not mutation. That's basically like alternative splice variation. So their genes
are hypermutation.
What's that?
It's hypermutation. It's programmed into your immune system.
Right. But we were saying that for a human being to evolve from a primate, for example, these occurrences would have to be, we're finding that human beings, for example, when we look at each other, we see weakness, especially compared to a chimp in almost every way, shape, and form. Besides our height, I think we took over on that one, but we see ourselves much weaker. So why would we have evolved every single beneficial physiological adaptation completely away? Even our methylation levels, for example, right? So we've lost our methylation levels. So we get most diseases. They're basically immune to infection. We're extremely weak. If we fall out of a tree, we break something or die, they're pretty good. They can eat pretty much anything. They just walk over, eat leaves completely. We can't do that. Our appendix is a backup immune system. It can't do jack shit to cellulose. You know, sorry, vegetarians. I know I made them mad, but you know, we don't do so good with these things. Humans are vastly weak compared to a primate. So we've somehow lost every single one of these beneficial adaptations just so we can talk.
Mm-hmm.
Some
of us got smarter, so we don't need strength anymore. It's no longer part of the selection pressure.
It would sure help us, though.
If you don't use it, you lose it. Is essentially what's happening.
I'm sure we always needed our hair. Why would we lose all of our body hair? Well, now we have to wear clothing. Humans never didn't wear clothing, so we lost all of our fur. Now we have to wear our clothing.
Mm-hmm.
That raises some very interesting questions about the differences between human beings and chimpanzees, actually, Matt. For example, human beings have skin that is extremely soft and tender and easily abrased and cut. You know, a chimpanzee has skin that's tough like leather, and it's nearly completely free of the ability to absorb water. Japanese monkeys in Japan sit in these thermal water, what do they call those? I forgot. Oh, hot springs, yeah. And they'll sit in the hot springs for hours, and they climb out, and their skin's not wrinkled. Now, you put a human being in a warm tub of water and put his hands and feet down in the water, and 30, 40 minutes later, he gets out, and his toes and hands are badly wrinkled because they absorb the crap out of water. But a chimpanzee's skin is nearly waterproof. It's almost like latex. So now you have to wonder, if evolution, why would evolution change if human beings are closely related to apes? Why would evolution make the skin of a human being so insufferably tender and easily abrased and cut and damaged, and so readily water absorbent? Is that really well suited for the environment of the Earth that we have today? I would say terribly not. So if we look at the, hold on, please, for just a second, please, sir. If we look at the biblical model, we see that God created a beautiful environment which was pristine and perfect for man in the beginning, and man didn't need clothes. He walked around nude. The temperature was absolutely perfect. Everything was exactly right for man's existence. He walked around in paradise, no clothing needed. He reached out to his left, picked a peach off a tree that was the size of a honeydew melon, and he lived in a blissful environment. The earth was perfectly suited for man. So if that environment's changed dramatically, and I would say the flood of Noah would explain that, now human beings designed to live in this paradisal environment don't have that environment anymore. Okay. They live in an environment where their tender, beautifully soft, extremely sensitive and tender, beautifully made skin, which is glorious and beautiful compared to that of a chimpanzee, is now easily damaged and harmed by the environment. We don't live in the environment God designed for us in the beginning. And so that really fits the biblical narration. It doesn't seem to fit the evolution one, though. That's the problem.
Okay, me and Standing have been talking, and since everybody has gotten a question so far, we're wanting to ask Taylor if he had any questions, any topic he wanted to bring up. Just go ahead, Taylor.
Well, thanks, Landon. Actually, Taylor, you can take as much time as you need to respond to what Neff said as well. We don't want you to, you can bring up any points you feel necessary. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've actually got to get going soon, but I'll address that and maybe a couple other questions if you guys want. So addressing the fitness of human skin, our environment is primarily social. We don't live in the woods. We don't need to have tough skin. There's no reason that's selected for anymore. And there's numerous explanations as to why. So we have soft skin that's nicer to touch. It's more sexually selective. It increases social bonding because you're skin to skin. And addressing something I think Ra said regarding human and ape relation, most of our differences between them is just a deletion of a few genes. So we're actually gaining functionality in some sense in our brain capacity from losing information, and that changes our environment because the smarter an animal is, usually the more social it is. They can sometimes be solo predators, but in our case, we're social animals.
But so are primates. Most of them are social as well. They're tribal.
Yeah, but the smarter you are, the more complex the social interactions can become.
But
So
here's a lot.
Let me finish. Our environment changed from living in the woods to living in the woods plus shelter, and then living in cities with shelter. And so there's just no more selection pressure for hairy bodies and thick skin. So it can either disappear by the wayside, and there's also selection for softer skin and for less hair, because humans actually can run a lot faster and have developed the ability to sweat because they don't have so much hair. And that's what makes us really great hunters.
Actually, we have the same amount of hair as a chimpanzee. Human beings have this.
Less
Human being. No, we have exactly the same number of, almost roughly the same number of pores. Well, follicles that produce hair. We have a different type of hair that covers most of our body. It's thin, it's really small and short, and it's called vellum hairs, and they're almost invisible. So we have roughly the same number of follicles on our body as a chimpanzee. But the question is, here's the thing, is if why would evolution make human skin so easily abrased and easily damaged in nature, if evolution were true and we came from chimpanzees? You see, it doesn't logically, it doesn't add up. That nature would create a human being to live in the same environment, clothesless, because, I mean, if you believe in uniformitarianism, you believe human beings, Homo sapiens, when he first became Homo sapiens, the best he had was a loincloth, maybe. I mean, why would he even do that? I mean, that's just storytelling right there. The human beings walked around, ugga bugga, wearing loincloths. I mean, that's storytelling. But why would evolution move an organism towards becoming, at the most incredible level, their skin itself becoming easily abrased and damaged and less able to cope with the environment? Evolution would have you believe that evolution modifies so that they're better suited to the environment, tougher and more resilient and more able to survive, right? But here, then, evolution takes a chimpanzee, which has a skin tough and stretchy, kind of like latex, and almost impervious to water, and then turns it into the super soft, supple, easily abrased, easily damaged. You can scratch yourself a little too much and get an abrasion. That's how easily damaged human skin is. It's amazingly tender, right? And evolution is going to make that kind of skin for a human being, while at the same time producing the most intelligence in a human being of any other animal. So you would think that evolution would not only make human beings, if they're the most intelligent, but also the most able somehow physically to survive the environment that makes them more intelligent in that same environment. You see what I mean? What I'm trying to point out to you is the evolution story just doesn't make sense. It's illogical. What do you have to say about that?
if you look at it like that, but there are numerous benefits to thin skin. I assume it helps a lot with sweating. I don't think it would be as easy to sweat on thick latex-like skin, but I'm not so sure about that. That could be anything. But not all animals benefit from the tank model. Not everything. That's only one evolutionary tactic. Not everything is just going to go straight towards as beefy and thick and tough as possible. That's just one strategy of survival.
But doesn't evolution move organisms towards fitness in their environment?
Yeah, and intelligence could be more fit than
But-
being super beefy. You might.
But human beings didn't make clothes for thousands upon thousands of years, according to evolutionists. So, I mean, they're walking around naked, scratching their crotches and stuff with, super sensitive skin. I mean, isn't that contrary to evolution? That evolution would make an organism less fit to survive in the environment by making their skin easily damaged. Doesn't that contradict the evolution theory?
No, because there's tons of monkeys with thin skin. They survive just fine.
Their skin is vastly tougher than a human being's, right?
Chimpanzees, but not other types of primates.
All primates, all apes' skin is vastly more tough than a human being's skin. Human skin is about the most easily abrased skin on the planet.
Animals survive with thin skin. It's not a requirement for survival. So it's like a role-playing game. We spec'd into intelligence. We didn't spend any of our upgrade points on tank.
So, but the question is,
rhinoceros.
So the question, though, is that why would evolution move the skin of a human being towards being so frail in the same environment as a chimpanzee and easily abrased, cut, infected, and possibly lead towards death?
They were living in different environments. The early hominids were living more on the plains.
Well, apes and human beings share the same environment, the surface of the earth, even to this very day.
But you understand how even the same kind can just divulge in two different directions in the same environment.
But that doesn't answer the question, sir.
One type of finch might evolve to have a bigger beak, while the same type of finch might evolve in a different direction from a different family.
But that doesn't answer the question why the evolution would move a human being's skin from so tough and nearly water insoluble to so frail as a human being's skin in comparison to that of a spider monkey or a orangutan or a chimpanzee or a gorilla. If evolution were true, why would evolution? You haven't actually addressed the question. Why would evolution move
sexual selection?
The skin. No, that's sexual selection is just reproduction.
Okay, to keep things moving, since standing is. I'm just talking with. Okay, go ahead, Taylor. After that, I'm going to say something real quick. Go ahead and finish, Taylor.
Sorry, I've just mentioned this multiple times. There's sexual selection. You're prettier with less hair on your face. That's just what we select for. It helps with cooling off. Thinner skin naturally is going to have it's going to cool off faster because it has less matter to go through. The heat does. I'm assuming that it helps with sweating as well because the transfer of the sweat through the pores would be easier on soft and supple skin. And that's one of the major steps in our evolution, was becoming long distance runner hunters. And the fact that oxytocin releases in greater quantities when we have skin to skin contact. So there are numerous benefits to go down that direction. And the smarter we get, the less reason we have to keep that toughness, because we don't need it anymore, because we have guns, we have spears, we can invent stuff to compensate for our lack of claws and whatever.
Okay. Is that it? Were you done?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Since you said you had to go soon, I guess we're going to get close to saying our closing remarks. Do you have any closing remarks you want to say? Then we'll move on to Nick. first, since you said you had to go soon.
Well, I would just say that micro changes, even within supposed biblical kinds, are just going to add up over time, and sooner or later you're going to hit that barrier. And creationists can't define where that barrier is, and evolutionists understand that it doesn't exist, and it adheres to all our models and everything we know about the molecular mechanisms.
All right. Well, thanks for saying that. We enjoyed you being on here. Standing, is there anything you want to say?
Yeah, I want to thank Taylor for joining us. It's been a lot of fun, a lot of great topics brought up. Hope the audience enjoyed. We're hoping for more of these types of discussions. Thanks to Neph, Landon, Ra, Matt, Jeremy. Guys, everyone have a good night, and hopefully we can do this again soon. Standing for Truth is out.